So India becomes independent under these less than desirable conditions. Again, millions of people displaced, uneducated, poor, um, but with some positive elements of the British legacy that might help it along. Now, very soon, within less than a year or so of independence, Mahatma Gandhi is actually assassinated by Hindu nationalists. So he was in charge under the INC, and so Nehru comes to power. He leads the INC, and he becomes the first prime minister of the country, and ultimately rules for 3 terms up until 1964. And during this period, as you'll see later, he begins to align the country with the Soviet Union. He's succeeded by Indira Gandhi, who is more authoritarian and more populist than Nehru had been, and she's actually charged with corruption and puts in place a state of emergency and suspends the Constitution from 1975 to 1977 in return for that compliment. And so what you see as a common theme here is that opposition parties create a coalition, the Jata Party, um, and they win big in 1977. And this is really the only period when the INC doesn't rule for much of Indian independence in the first several decades after World War II. So the opposition comes together, but they've got aspirations. Each of their members wants to be something big. They've got ideological differences, and this is very typical of broad opposition blocs. What it means is that they can't govern. And so in the 1980s, Indira's INC comes back. Once again, there's a state of emergency that she launches in 1984. This time because of ethnic conflict and autonomy demands. And then Indira is assassinated in 1984 during this state of emergency. With her assassination, you've got this interesting political phenomenon where Rajiv Gandhi comes to power, to her son. He comes to power on this post-assassination sympathy. Um, and we've seen this in other places as well, where someone's either their spouse, their brother, their whatever it is, their mother, their father is killed, and then they are able to capitalize on this politically. What's interesting about the case of Rajiv Gandhi, though, is that unlike his mother, he's not a populist, and he's also not an authoritarian per se. What he is he's a technocrat, and he's a technocrat who demands a liberal market. So by technocrat, I mean someone much more akin to a bureaucrat than a politician. Doesn't really care how they get from A to Z. They want to go there as quickly as possible. He is actually assassinated by the Tamils in 1991, which ends the period of INC rule. So INC rule really goes from 1948 all the way up until 1991, with the exception of this opposition period from 77 to 80. So very important. This massive opposition movement, which led the opposition to British dominance in India and led the independence movement, comes to power and stays to power for a long, long time. It's hard to shake. And it's important to consider why, because we'll talk about this with respect to South Africa as well. This is not unusual. Okay? And also not unusual is the fact that post-independence opposition groups that come together are much more likely to fragment quickly. So throughout the 1990s, you had a series of coalition governments that generally maintained Rajiv's reforms, which were, again, these neoliberal reforms demanding the liberalization of an economy that had sort of been modeled in some ways on the Soviet plank, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. The main INC competitor throughout the 1990s and up until today is the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, composed of largely Hindu nationalists, which has actually organized and or supported communal violence against Muslims in India. But note that the BJP, when it's been in governing coalitions, has moderated its stance and focused on continued economic growth and stability with its neighbors. And this is also important, and I've alluded to this several times in this class, which is that when you have sides that are more to the left or more to the right, once they actually take power, they tend to moderate. When they don't, you may well see a disaster of sorts, but they tend to. So going into the constitutional order, India is privileged to having the longest constitution in the world, which enshrines institutions that are based largely on the British system. Um, we'll start with the judiciary. The judiciary was adopted from the British legal system, which was established in the mid 19th century. So it's a common, and it was established in the mid 19th century. It's a common law system. And if you look around at who else has the common law system, well, you see some trends. Obviously, there's the UK and the US, which we've talked about. There's also Pakistan, there's Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa. So you probably see a trend here, and that all these belonged to the Brits at some point. Um, the courts in India have an enormous backlog. There are allegations of corruption and cases that just aren't heard for in a reasonable time. By a reasonable time, I mean that the Delhi High Court, for example, has a backlog supposedly of 460 plus years, according to its Chief Justice. That's a long time. Um, the Supreme Court, which again is what we are most interested in here, is composed of 31 justices who are appointed by the president in consultation with the Supreme Court. To be on the Supreme Court, interestingly, the consideration is really seniority rather than political preferences, unlike in our system, where people want to know where you stand on these various issues. Here it's a question of seniority. How long have you been around? Once you're actually on the court, you can only be removed by the president and two-thirds of each House of Parliament, although there is a mandatory retirement age at 65. India's Supreme Court has been highly independent. They've got their own form of judicial review where they can actually go in and rule on acts of Parliament. Parliament can reverse their rulings, however, by amending the Constitution, and it does this frequently. So the Supreme Court will go in, they say we don't like this bill, and then Parliament will go in and they'll amend the Constitution, hence a very long Constitution. And they've done this on average about twice a year. A question that you might want to consider, that I may well ask, is how might the Indian Supreme Court function differently than the U.S. one based on the membership criteria? So think about independence, think about ideological, think about the confirmation process or the nomination process, etc. This may be a question that I put up. In terms of the executive, actually, I'm going to take this in a separate set of slides.